Guys, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends and family. Also, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. It was supposed to be a simple college year, but it quickly became anything but. I didn't know it at the time, but my life was about to take a very unexpected turn. I was living with a guy named Matt in a tiny apartment. We had ended up as roommates because we both needed to split rent. I didn't really know him, but he seemed like a decent guy. He was quiet and kept to himself mostly, which worked for me. In the beginning, we didn't talk much. We'd say hi when we passed each other, and sometimes we'd watch TV together if we were both home at the same time. Nothing weird, just a couple of strangers trying to make it work. But then things started to get off. Matt would leave late at night, sometimes not getting back until early in the morning. I thought maybe he was just out partying or hanging out with friends. He didn't seem like the kind of guy who'd do anything shady, but after a while, I started feeling like something wasn't quite right. He'd come home with this strange look in his eyes, almost like he was seeing something that wasn't there. It was hard to explain, but it made me feel uncomfortable. One night I came back from work and the apartment was eerily quiet. The lights were dim, and there was a strange sound coming from Matt's room. It was soft at first, almost like someone was crying. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I should check on him. I hesitated but eventually knocked on his door. No answer. Then, right as I was about to walk away, the crying stopped. I heard a muffled voice, Matt's voice, saying he was just tired and going to bed. I didn't think too much of it, but the next day, I started noticing little things. Like his clothes would have stains on them, stains that didn't look like they came from regular things, like food. It wasn't a big deal at first, but it felt odd. Then I found a knife in the bathroom one day, hidden under a pile of towels. It had dried blood on it. I felt my stomach twist. I didn't know what to make of it, so I asked him about it. "Oh, I cut myself while cooking," he said, like it was nothing. It sounded fine at the time, but now looking back, it felt like a weak excuse. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with him. I started avoiding him. I spent more time out with friends, at work, anywhere but home. I felt like I couldn't trust him anymore, but I didn't know why. Then one evening, I decided to get to the bottom of it. I came home early, and Matt wasn't around. I knew he wouldn't be back for a while, so I figured it was a good time to look around. I wasn't proud of snooping, but something pushed me to do it. I went into his room and I noticed something. A box tucked away under his bed, half hidden by clothes. My heart started racing. I don't know why, but I just knew it was something important. When I opened it, I almost wished I hadn't. Inside were newspaper clippings, stories about missing people, about murders that hadn't been solved yet. There were photos too, blurry ones, of people who looked like they just disappeared. But what made my blood run cold were the notes. Notes written in Matt's handwriting, details about the victims, and the crime scenes. It was all so wrong. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out of there. I quickly shut the box, but my hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the cops? Should I leave? Should I confront him? My mind was spinning, but one thing was certain. I had to get out. I left the apartment and went straight to a nearby park. I sat on a bench, trying to calm down, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found. I ended up calling the police. I told them everything I knew, the box, the articles, the photos, and the notes. I couldn't believe I was saying it out loud. But the more I talked, the more I realized I had to act on this. The cops took it seriously. They asked me to stay with a friend, and they promised they'd handle it from there. They told me they'd investigate Matt, but it would take some time. I spent the next few days on edge. Every time my phone rang, my heart would skip a beat. Finally, the call came. The police had arrested Matt. They'd found him trying to get rid of more stuff, evidence linking him to the crimes. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My roommate, the guy I'd shared an apartment with for months, was a murderer. When I went back to the apartment to pack up my things, it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place where something dark had been hiding, just out of sight. Every corner of the apartment felt wrong. As I packed, I found a note in my room. It was from Matt. I wasn't sure what I expected, but not this. Sorry you found out this way. I never meant to hurt you. You were the only real friend I had. Goodbye. I couldn't believe it. My mind couldn't wrap around the fact that the guy I had lived with for all that time was hiding such a huge secret. It felt like I had been living in a completely different world, the kind of world where nothing is as it seems. I left that night and never looked back. I moved to another city, hoping to forget all of it. But I couldn't. The images from the box still haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Matt's face. I saw the pictures of the people he had hurt. I still wonder how I didn't see it sooner. How I didn't realize that the person I was living with could be capable of such terrible things. Now I'm different. I've learned to be more careful, more aware of the people around me. I don't let anyone get too close. I can't help it. The fear still lingers. It's like a shadow that follows me, a reminder of how easy it is to miss the signs, how easy it is to live with someone who is hiding the darkest parts of themselves. I try not to let it define me, but it's hard not to. After all, Matt wasn't the person I thought he was. He was someone much darker, and that's something I'll never forget. It was late one night when things started to go wrong. I was driving down a long, empty highway, just me and the road. The only light came from my car's headlights and the pale moon hanging in the sky. It was pretty late, and I was tired after a long day. My radio had stopped working miles back, so the only sound was the hum of the engine and my own thoughts. As I drove, I noticed my gas gauge was getting dangerously low. I should have filled up at the last town, but I figured I could make it to the next one. Now, though, I wasn't so sure. The needle was barely above empty, and there wasn't a gas station in sight. Just as I started to worry, the car sputtered and slowed down. I pressed the gas pedal, but it didn't help. The engine made a weird choking sound, and then it died completely. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, my heart sinking in my chest. No, 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 I mumbled, turning the key in the ignition. The engine cranked, but nothing happened. I was out of gas, stuck in the middle of nowhere. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but of course there was no signal. I was completely cut off. The road was deserted, with only trees and darkness around me. I locked the car doors and decided to wait inside, hoping someone would drive by, or maybe the signal would come back. I didn't want to wander around in the dark. It felt safer inside the car. Time passed slowly. I checked my phone every few minutes, but there was still no signal. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my nerves starting to fray. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw something moving. My heart jumped in my chest. I turned my head, and through the darkness I saw a figure walking toward me. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but then it got closer. It was a man, tall, thin, with messy hair and a scruffy beard. He looked like he had been living out in the woods for a while. He walked up to my car and stopped by the driver's side window, staring inside with wide, wild eyes. Then he started knocking on the window, slow at first, then harder. The sound echoed in the quiet night. "Hey, let me in," he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "I need help." I froze. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and I shook my head. There was no way I was letting a stranger into my car, especially not out here. "Please," he said, knocking harder. "Let me in." I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with all sorts of wild ideas. What did he want? Why was he out here in the middle of the night? Then, just as I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw headlights in the distance. A car was coming. I honked the horn, hoping to get the driver's attention. The car slowed down and pulled up behind me. It was a police car. 2 officers got out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The man from the woods stepped back, looking nervous. "Is everything okay?" one of the officers asked, shining his flashlight into my car. I quickly unlocked the door and got out. "My car ran out of gas," I said, my voice shaky. This man came out of the woods and started knocking on my window. "I don't know what he wants." The officers turned to the man, who was now standing a few feet away, looking anxious. "Sir, what are you doing out here?" one officer asked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he just turned and walked back into the woods. The officers watched him go, then turned back to me. "You're lucky we showed up," one officer said. "It's not safe to be out here alone at night. We'll call a tow truck for you and give you a ride to the nearest town." I nodded, feeling a wave of relief. As I climbed into the back of the police car, I glanced back at the woods. The man had disappeared into the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped something bad. That night was unforgettable. It reminded me how quickly things can go wrong and how important it is to be prepared. I'll never forget that strange encounter, and I still wonder what would have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. When I was 30, I decided to rent a room in an old house. The rent was cheap, and the landlord, Mr. Thompson, seemed eager to lease the place without asking too many questions. I thought that was a little odd, but I needed a place to stay fast, so I didn't think much of it. The house was old but cozy. It had 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a comfy living room, and a bathroom I had to share with my roommate, Elizabeth. Elizabeth worked nights, slept during the day, and kept mostly to herself. We never really crossed paths, and I had lived there for over a month without actually seeing her much. At first, everything seemed fine, but then weird things started happening. My belongings would be moved around. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, but then find them on the dining table. My toothbrush would be wet even though I hadn't used it. I thought I might be just forgetting things, but the strange feeling kept growing. One day I came home from work to find the front door slightly open. I was sure I had locked it that morning. I stepped inside cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no answer. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I double-checked all the windows and doors that night to make sure everything was locked. Then there were the strange sounds. Late at night, I would hear footsteps above me, even though Elizabeth was supposed to be at work. One night, I even heard faint humming, like someone singing a lullaby. It was eerie, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The turning point came one Friday night when I decided to relax and watch TV in the living room. I was trying to unwind after a long week, but then I felt it, the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, but there was no one there. I tried to ignore it, but suddenly the living room light flickered off. My heart jumped in my chest. I turned around slowly, and there she was, Elizabeth, standing in the hallway. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, then turned and walked away. "Elizabeth?" I called out, but she didn't answer. I quickly turned the light back on and hurried to my room, locking the door behind me. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about her standing there in the dark watching me. The next morning I had enough. I packed a bag and went to a nearby motel to get away for a while. I called Mr. Thompson and told him about the strange things happening. He seemed concerned but didn't offer much help. The next day I went back to the house to gather my things. The house felt different, quieter. I walked to Elizabeth's door and it was slightly open. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark, but I could see a small bed, a dresser, and some old photographs on the wall. It looked like no one had lived there for years. I stepped inside and looked at the photos. One of them caught my attention. It was of a woman who looked just like Elizabeth. The photo was taken years ago. There was also one of Mr. Thompson, much younger, standing next to the woman. It was dated 20 years ago. My heart raced. The woman in the photo was Elizabeth, but how could that be? She looked the same now as she did then. Suddenly, I heard a creak behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I grabbed the photo and ran out of the house, my mind racing. I went straight to Mr. Thompson's office. When I showed him the photo, he went pale. He told me that Elizabeth was his sister, who had disappeared 20 years ago under mysterious circumstances. He had kept her room exactly the same, hoping she would come back one day. I was both scared and sad. The Elizabeth I had been living with wasn't really her. It was something else. I didn't know what to think anymore. I just knew I couldn't stay there. I moved out that day and found a new place to live. I never went back to that house. Sometimes late at night, I still think about Elizabeth. Who or what was she? Some mysteries are better left unsolved. This happened 2 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I live in the countryside of Ireland, far from the nearest town, surrounded by fields and quiet roads. Most nights, the only sounds I hear are the occasional cow escaping from the field next door, or my dog barking at someone walking by. It's peaceful, and I love it. But one night, something happened that still unsettles me to this day. It was late spring, and the sky was clear. I remember stepping into the kitchen around midnight to grab a snack. As I opened the cupboard, I heard a noise outside. At first, I figured it was just an animal, a fox maybe, or even a deer moving through the brush. But the sound didn't go away. In fact, it got louder. Curious, I walked over to the window and pushed it open a little to hear better. That's when I noticed my dog standing by the back door, completely still. Normally, she barks at anything that moves. Cats, birds, even the wind sometimes. But this time, she was silent. Her ears were perked up, and she was staring at the forest behind our house. Something about the way she stood there made me uneasy. Then I heard it. The sound was strange, like metal scraping against something, but with a rough, croaky quality. It wasn't a sound I had ever heard before, and it sent a chill up my spine. My dog didn't move, didn't growl, didn't bark. She just kept staring into the darkness. And that scared me more than anything. She's a big dog, the kind that doesn't scare easily. If something had her frozen like that, then I didn't want to know what it was. I hesitated for a second, then decided I wasn't going to stand around trying to figure it out. I called her inside, locked the door, and went to bed. But the noises didn't stop. As I lay in bed, trying to convince myself it was just some animal rummaging around outside, I realized something. The sound had moved. It was no longer coming from behind the house. Now it was at the front. That didn't make sense. How had it moved so fast? I shut my curtains, trying to block it out. Maybe if I ignored it, it would go away. I curled up under my blankets, trying to get comfortable. Just as I started to relax, I heard a soft tap on my window. Tap. I held my breath, listening. Tap, tap. Then a steady rhythm. It sounded like small stones being tossed against the glass. My stomach clenched. I didn't move. I didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, hoping it would stop. The tapping continued for what felt like forever. My heart pounded in my chest and my mind raced with questions. Who or what was out there? Should I check? Should I call someone? I thought about grabbing my phone, but my hands were frozen in fear. Eventually, at some point, I must have drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned the noises to my neighbors. I expected them to brush it off, maybe say it was just some animal, but instead they gave each other a strange look. That's when I found out that a man had recently moved into a house just around the corner. According to them, he wasn't exactly the kind of person you wanted as a neighbor. He had a history of trouble with the law, and rumors were already going around that he was involved in something illegal, possibly drugs. That made my stomach drop. Had he been the one outside my house that night? About a month later, a huge stash of drugs was found in a shed nearby, and just like that, the man disappeared. No one ever saw him again. Thinking back, I can't help but wonder, was he trying to scare me that night? Maybe he was high. Maybe he thought my house belonged to someone else. Or maybe he was just messing around. But there's one thing that still doesn't sit right with me. How did he make that sound? That strange, scraping, croaky noise that lasted for hours? And how did it move so quickly around my house? And most of all, what would have happened if I had gone outside to check? I'll never know for sure. But even now, every time I hear an unusual noise at night, I get that same uneasy feeling in my chest. Because sometimes the scariest part of a story isn't what you know, it's what you'll never find out.